Welcome to NieuwRechts, or for our English listeners, NieuwRight. My name is Daniel de Liever, and today we're going to talk about the political situation in Austria. And I'm glad today to again talk about this important topic with Ralph Schoellhammer. Thank you for being here.
Hi Daniel, great to be back.
Yes, so I think last time we talked quite a bit about your background. So I would really advise people who want to hear more about your background to go back to our previous talk. But in short, basically, now you are leading this MCC Center for Applied History and International Relations Theory. It's a whole lot to one sentence. And I guess you're known as a public commentator, intellectual. Before we dive into Austrian politics, because I think you actually, last time we talked, you were just in the sorts to get this new role, right? To change a little bit to this.
Yes.
So how is it can you first tell me what is it? Applied history and international relations theory.
Well, the main idea about applied history is it kind of goes back to the idea that was first formulated by Henry Kissinger, that history to a nation is like character to a person. And if you want to understand international politics, if you want to understand IR theory, if you want to understand diplomacy of any kind, you need to understand a country's history. Like, we cannot explain everything with history, but we can explain a fair part, a fair share of it. And if you don't understand the historical experiences of a nation or of a country, it's very difficult to understand how they currently behave. I mean, as I've made this argument many times before, if you take the Ukrainian-Russian conflict at the moment, for example, there's a lot of historical background to this. Now, to be very clear, this does not mean that anybody is condoning a Russian behavior, is condoning any kind of an invasion. But good diplomacy is not condoning what somebody does, but it's understanding why they do it. So this, I think, is something we have entirely forgotten. We are very quick in the West to condemn something morally, which is fine, but that is not a replacement for good diplomacy. If I want to come to agreements that hold, if I want to have efficient ways of negotiating settlements that will endure, I need to understand what motivated the other side in the first place, because then I can create situations where both sides, at least in their minds, think that they have won the conflict. And I think, again, that's very difficult, but this is a little bit what we try to do at the center, to try to understand countries out of the perspective of their own history. And I feel that has not been done a lot in recent years. And I hope that we can restart something that is very important in this area.
I think indeed we need this a lot in the West. It kind of reminds me, I always have this, you could say, argument with my wife, and I say, I understand, but I don't agree. It's basically something like this is how you can summarize it. And I agree, we need a lot more diplomacy and a little bit less, I guess, arrogance, that there's only one simplistic way to look at the world. And how is it actually to run this department? Because I can imagine it's quite different from what you did before at the Webster Vienna Private University.
Well, I can only stress that the MCC, in my experience, both the MCC here in Budapest, which is the main MCC institution, but also the think tank in Brussels, the MCC Brussels, I have in my now over 20 years at universities and think tanks and academic institutions, I've never experienced that level of academic freedom before. So this idea that is kind of circulating, particularly in Brussels and outside of Central Europe, that everything in Hungary is controlled by the government and there is no freedom of thought and no freedom of speech, and everybody has to, swear an oath on a picture of Viktor Orban when they come to work in the morning. So this is all not true. It's quite the contrary. I have to admit, in many ways, I think Budapest as a city, because I split my time between Vienna in Austria and Budapest here in Hungary. I have to admit, in many ways, I find Budapest is maybe not a more liberal ideologically, but a freer city than, for example, Vienna is. When it comes to a sense of security. So, am I afraid if I go out at night? No. Are the shops open longer? Significantly. And I know these are small things, but these are the small things that make life convenient. And to be quite honest, an expectation I have from any government is to create circumstances in which I can then, based on my own skills and talents, live the best possible version of myself, as a productive, contributing member of society. And I feel that here in Hungary, these opportunities are definitely there. And of course, I'm sure, Daniel, that you have followed this in great detail as well. As we have found out, due to the the doings of Elon Musk and Donald Trump in the United States is that a lot of the so-called independent media opposition in Europe, and that's not just true in Hungary, I think that's true elsewhere as well, was financed by left-leaning US NGOs.
Yes.
So once again, we entered this territory. What just a couple of weeks ago was a right-wing conspiracy theory turns out to be much closer to the truth than many would have expected.
Vergeet de NOS en de NPO. Het is tijd voor NieuwRechts. De nieuwswebsite voor rechtsdenkend Nederland.
Exactly. Actually, in the Netherlands, we have, I guess, two big Belgium companies that control most of the mainstream media. And I guess one of the two big companies, indeed, was found to be directly being founded by US aid. So in this sense, yes, it's not a conspiracy theory. We just see it's reality. That's why on the left, everybody's panicking. You can see that. And it's ironic, right, that Hungary has been, I guess, advocating for less of this influence for such a long time, and especially now the European Union is attacking them, and even Czech Republic is now also helping the European Commission in their lawsuit against Hungary over specifically this topic. So it's a sad thing to see. We have so many, I guess, greater things we could do in Europe if we would not have to focus on this kind of things.
Well, I think you're right. Although I would add one of the reasons why I believe that there is always a particular ire towards Hungary is because the right wing in Hungary is different from the right wing in the rest of the West, in the sense that there is a general agreement from Trump to others. I think Trump also has changed in this respect, which was that we are against, wokeness, identity politics, the whole shibboleth that you find on the left. But they didn't really have an alternative model. So and this was one of the reasons why the right was never that dangerous. And again, I would say the same is true in the United States. And George W. Bush was never really a danger to the left, because he didn't like left-wing ideology, but he didn't really have a right-wing ideology with which he could have replaced the dominant left-wing ideology. The difference in Hungary is that they are not just anti-left liberal. They actually have an idea what they wanted to replace with. And this is, I think, also what you see now in the United States happening is this is not just Trump saying, I don't like woke. This is saying, we're going to not just dismantle woke, we're going to replace it with something else, right? For example, the one executive order that he signed that basically said that in schools and public institutions, what is to be taught is to be reinforcing, is to be uplifting in a sense, is to incentivize patriotism, loyalty to the country, and all these kind of things, which I all agree with. But that's the big difference that we see now compared to even 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, is that the right knew it was opposed to the left, but it didn't really have a replacement idea what to do if they should ever defeat the left. And this was the problem in 2016, right? Trump won against Hillary Clinton. He came into office, but he knew what he didn't like. He knew what he liked, but he didn't really have the people or the coherent worldview to do something differently. That's different now. I mean, we talked about this last time. I mean, I cannot stress enough. I think that the fact that he lost, whether he did or he did not, but the fact that he did not continue his presidency in 2020, but came now in 2024, I think was the best thing that could have happened to him.
Blessing in disguise, so to speak.
Yes, sometimes you need time to reflect. So taking a sabbatical and then coming back with fresh energy and having reflected on what you like to accomplish and how you want to accomplish it probably was not the worst thing to happen.
I agree, and I hope we can carry some of that over into Europe, because you just said, like, Hungary, they are different. They have this actual vision of what they can replace the left-wing ideology with. But now, of course, we're going to talk today about the situation in Austria. I'm curious if you think that, like, parties like FPÖ, which are like the right-wing party in Austria, that if they have something like an alternative vision, or are they also more of the anti-woke, anti-left-wing kind of party? What do you think?
That's a good question. I think they do. I mean, currently the negotiations about the new coalition government between the I always call them the fake or lukewarm conservatives and the Freedom Party, which usually is described as the right-wing party, but I would say they are just genuine conservatives in many ways, are at the high point now. Some of the negotiation points and papers have been leaked, and the media, everybody's up in arms that they have to stop negotiating, they have to stop forming that coalition government, because apparently the Freedom Party is driving a very hard bargain. They do the same thing as you just described previously, what Trump is doing in the US. They want to see not just a few bits and pieces of their ideas in place. They want to see the broad thrust of their ideology in place. And that, I said this before, this is very different. The right wing in the US, but also in Europe, has grown a spine in recent months, or in recent weeks, if you want. We'll see where this all is going to go. Is it just a temporary flash in the pan, or is this going to be something that can be sustainable? I'm sure that you and NieuwRechts have reported on the meeting of the European patriots in Madrid, right, where you had Viktor Orban and Geert Wilders and many of the other players. That's a kind of self-confidence in the way they now also appear in public. Matteo Salvini, of course, was there also. That didn't happen in the past. Usually they met somewhere, and it was, some newspapers reported that it was some back room or some ballroom of a hotel. But this was like an event. I mean, it was like a stage, and you could sense the energy. So something is going on, and you see this now also in the formation of governments. And of course, the big task. I just want to make it a little bit broader, because I assume that your viewers and listeners are not that interested just in Austria. The big test of all of this will be in. Well, it's in about a little over 2 weeks when we have elections in Germany. So this is because Germany is still the 20,000 or the 2,000 pound gorilla in the room for all their idiocies and weaknesses. They still are the dominant economy, for now at least, on the old continent. So if they make this shift to the right substantially, I think that would be the ultimate game changer. And it's like with polls during the US election. We'll see what the outcome is, but I wouldn't trust in the current polls as much as many do. I think that the AfD is going to surprise on the upside.
That's interesting. Yes, we talk a lot also at NieuwRechts at German elections. First of all, of course, for the Netherlands, Germany is one of the most important countries, both culturally but also economically. And I agree. If you zoom out, it's also very important for the West in general and Europe especially. I think just to comment on that, I think the problem with Germany will be, even if let's say they get 30% of the votes, then as long as CDU does not want to rule with them, then they cannot do anything. So you will get in a situation probably where nothing can happen. Either CDU commits political suicide and tries to go with the left, the SPD, etc. But if you go with the AfD, I think there's so much still of the Second World War trauma that is living in some ways in that society, that it's I can maybe in some sense also in Austria, I don't know exactly, but in the Netherlands this is much less of a problem, I think.
No, I think you're right, but that assessment is very true, and it's to a smaller extent true in Austria as well, and probably to an even smaller extent in the Netherlands. But as you correctly pointed out, this trauma, and that is there, I think that's a very good and very, very accurate assessment. But if you look at the younger generation, it's for them, it's further and further and further away. So when the right started in the Netherlands, if you think about Pim Fortuyn and kind of the first runs in politics of Geert Wilders, or the early days of the Freedom Party, or the early successful days, let's put it this way, because the party has been around for a while, in the 90s, there was still a substantial part of the population that either directly or indirectly, kind of their parents, if you will, have experienced the period of World War II. Yes. But the generation that actually experienced it directly is slowly dying off. Because it happened 80 years ago, so that's really a long time ago. And those who kind of indirectly, who were born, let's say, in 42, 43, 44, and therefore the shadow, if you want, of these events was still very large in their life, they are now themselves grandparents. But if I talk to my students, for example, here at the MCC or in Vienna or elsewhere, for many of them, just to give you a perspective here, I mean, I don't know how old you are, Daniel, and I'm not going to ask because it would be impolite. I'm not going to ask you for your golf handicap and your age. But for many of them, 9/11 happened before they were born. So for them, the fall of the Berlin Wall, 9/11, at the end of World War II, that's all something that happened. Like they were not even remotely conscious at that time. So, and you see this also now, I think, in these protests, by the way, referring back to what we said before, that are also very often financed by USAID, by NGOs close to Soros, close to the government. So all these anti-right-wing protests are not real grassroots movements. They are financed by NGOs, and these NGOs are financed by the government. So we really have to redefine what we mean by non-governmental organization. But we can put a pin in that and talk about this a little bit later. But for most young people, this historical period, they might be interested in it. That's possible. It is, and it's important to know about it. But it doesn't really influence their political decision-making that much anymore. And we see this, by the way, if you look at the polls in Austria, and we talked about this last time, in Germany. I don't know how it is in the Netherlands. You have to tell me. But it's actually the 60-plus people that prevents the right wing from being even stronger, because the youth vote is solidly moving to the right.
I think it's the same in the Netherlands. I would say, for me personally, like I have a Jewish background, and of course in Jewish community, World War II still lives, if you ask me, also too much. I think that's another trauma of that period, which I think is also unhealthy. I understand that it's I don't want to say it's not significant, because of course it was, especially for Jewish communities in Europe, it was extremely important. But I think you also need to look forward. And I think indeed, this is a reason why I also see a lot of Jewish people look, for example, in America, why they are refusing to vote right, because this is association with Nazism, which is ridiculous, that every right-wing party would be fascist or Nazi. But this is something indeed that, just like you're saying in general with as they say, like the boomer generation, that they have a hard time letting go. But I do think, especially as we're now moving into this new age, where new media and a new way of communicating is becoming more popular, there's more room also for young people to take a bigger voice. Like I'm 27, and if you want to talk about age, so yes, it's a different world now than it was 10, 20 years ago.
No, and you're right. And the point is, I completely agree. Nobody's talking about forgetting it, right? And nobody.
Yes.
And I always, and I make this argument, and I make it here, and I make it everywhere else as well. I do think that especially the Germans and the Austrians, because of the history, we have a special responsibility both to Israel and to the Jewish populations. I mean, this cannot be denied. And I do believe, contrary to what many others say, I think that there is we have. Let's put it this way. Maybe not guilt. I don't think that guilt can be passed on, but responsibility can be passed on, right? So if your father hypothetically commits a crime and you know the victims of that crime, you are not guilty of that crime. But I think if you are a good person, you would take responsibility for the crime that was committed by your father. And I think the same is true historically here. I'm not guilty of the Holocaust, but I have responsibility for it because it was done by the very people I identify with, right? So I think this is why in Germany, and I think in the Netherlands is similar, but not as tricky or as complex, but why being a patriot or a nationalist in Germany and Austria is very difficult, because you're forced to love a country, or in my case, you want to love a country that has such a horrific, difficult history. But on the other hand, of course, I would make the argument that what we have seen on the political left, which professes not to be bound by these sentiments because they are not nationalist, they're not patriotic, they don't believe in their country. Yet at the same time, they have been the worst allies of the Jewish communities and populations in Europe, because they opened up what they were mainly, with the exception of Angela Merkel, who was a conservative in name only. As many say, she probably was the first green chancellor of Germany. They opened up the borders to the very people that would be, I would say, more than, not all of them, but many of them, who would be absolutely okay with a second Holocaust from occurring. So a recent German journalist said, well, for the German and the Austrian left, apparently, and please don't take this out of context, but the argument is, or kind of this journalist said, it seems that for the left, only a dead Jew is a good Jew, and meaning by that is,
it's true. I've heard this as well, and the irony is, even like, look, if the Soviet Union, my wife comes from the former Soviet Union. Her parents could not keep their Jewish name if they wanted to get into university, so they had to take like a Russian name, so they couldn't be accepted, because there was quotas of how many Jews were allowed. So if you're going to say that only the right wing has a history of anti-Semitism, then you don't know your history.
No, I mean, anti-Semitism is, one has to, shockingly, is the most adaptable ideology there is. Like it's the one that, no matter what happens, unfortunately in Europe, anti-Semitism always survives.
Yes.
It's like I said, there can be there is anti-Semitism on the right, there's anti-Semitism on the left, there's anti-Semitism in the environmental movement. Think about Greta Thunberg.
Yes.
There's anti-Semitism in the wherever it is. There's in the anti-vax movement, in the protest. You can look for because they just, they always find somebody who could, who has a Jewish sounding name, and then it's a Jewish. It's always very. I'm always reminded that in the 1930s, right, in the UK, you had protesters in the street who were chanting "Jews back to Palestine."
Yes.
Then after 48, the Jews did go back to Palestine, and now you have people demonstrating in London, Jews out of Palestine. So it doesn't matter where the Jews go. Somebody will tell them that they shouldn't be there. It's a frustrating continuity of Western, and I think that's true for Western culture in general. That anti-Semitism always has a presence. It's very, very odd, and then it's always in supposedly sophisticated circles. That's the thing that I always find also so interesting. I always saw it's the racism of the fake intellectual, right? You're not supposed to be a racist against all other groups, but when it comes to the Jews, then all of a sudden, no, the machinations, and it's very fun. And even people I like, right?
Yes, I get your point. And the other end, only thing I want to say on this topic still is, I think some people are also oversensitive on it. For example, a good example of this, if you're critical of Soros, and because Soros is Jewish, then you're anti-Semite, which is, of course, very ridiculous. So you can be critical of Jewish people or of Israel, whatever. It doesn't make you an anti-Semite. And I think this is what the complexity people don't understand. And I think also a lot of Jewish people and Jewish community is oversensitive on this, which makes it problematic, because if there's actual anti-Semitism, it's like the boy who cried wolf, right? If you do it too many times, then this becomes a problem. And this is something as, let's say, a right-wing Jew, this is something I try to balance between.
No, you're right? And I think that is true. And of course, I mean, everybody can criticize the government of Israel. Everybody can criticize George Soros, who I have to admit, the Soros family is always Jewish when it fits their purpose, but never if it doesn't.
Yes.
So I think it's like me saying, when I would refer to my Catholicism, I'm a believer, but I'm not a very good Catholic. So if somebody attacks me and I say, "Oh, you're just doing this because you're anti-Catholic," it would be ridiculous.
Yes.
But my argument in this conversation usually is always, you're correct, but it's not the criticizing. For me, it's always the obsession.
Yes.
What I mean by this, if you have people who never demonstrated for Tibet or for Hong Kong or for East Timor, but all of a sudden are 5 days a week out in the streets to demonstrate for Palestine and against genocide and Jewish apartheid, then I become suspicious, because why is it that it's just this one conflict and this one, if you want to describe it as such, injustice that gets you out on the street, but none of the other ones. And this is then where I say it might not be then open anti-Semitism, but it's on the brink. It's the obsession with the Jew. It's not just the hatred with it. It's the obsession. And whatever happens, you get starry-eyed and say, so where could be the Jewish involvement? When then people say, that the migration is controlled by the Jews, and and then they dig up some guy who at some point somewhere had a Jewish great grandmother, and therefore obviously it's a Jewish conspiracy. And it's the obsession, right? The looking into and you be surprised how quickly you do actually sound like a Nazi. Like when you all of a sudden say you have to look in people's ancestry, and there was the Jewish grandparent. It's very odd.
That's a fair point. Let's get back to Austria.
Yes. Sorry.
No. It's a good topic to talk about. But I think in line of this, I'm curious. Do you think that the FPÖ, of course, became the biggest party at the last elections? Do you think they're also getting more normalized in Austrian society?
Well, I would argue that, of course, full disclosure here, I'm a sympathizer. I consider myself politically to the right, so I naturally have a positive bias towards right-wing parties. But I would argue, and I would make the same argument with the official positions. We can talk about specific politicians a little bit later, but if you look at the party program and the official positions of the parties, I would say that they always represented quote-unquote normal positions. Mm-hmm. It is only that media, culture, academia moved so far to the left. I mean, everybody knows the meme by now, right? Kind of where you stand in the middle and the left moved so far to the left that all of a sudden, even though your position hasn't changed, you are now all of a sudden far right.
Yes.
And I think this is also what we've seen in Germany, in Austria, in the Netherlands, actually all over the West, that most people, I would say, are open to migration in small doses and based on needs, right?
Yes.
Nobody has a problem with skilled workers. I think they're critical of unskilled mass migration from areas of the world that are culturally vastly different. I think they're opposed to seeing the neighborhoods change at a speed and in a direction they don't like. I think that they're generally pro, free market economy with a strong safety net. So I think all the things, common sense positions, I do think they think that in schools, it's more important for children to learn, arithmetic, biology, actual biology, not gender indoctrination biology. There are 10,000 sexes or whatever. So I think most common sense people have the same positions that these right-wing parties are holding, but they have been blackmailed into professing allegiance to other positions because out of fear of social ostracization, which I understand. Right? If you go, I don't go to cocktail parties very often. You probably neither. But there was things that you for a long time were not supposed to say in polite society.
Yes.
Opposing the Pride Progress flag on public buildings, or saying there are only two genders, or saying that, yes, there is a cultural component to migration and some people from other parts of this world do not fit very well with our society. So the numbers of them coming in should be very, very small. That not every single person on this planet has a right to asylum. But these are all things that most people, if you talk to them, one-on-one, would agree with, but it's something they wouldn't like to say in public. And that is changing. So in many ways, what we are experiencing is not the population or the triumph of the right. It's a triumph. That's what Ben Shapiro calls it, but I think he's right. He calls it the revenge of the normies, but we can also call it the triumph of the normies. And I think he's right in that. You see the same. Sorry, just this last point. And I don't want to always refer back to the United States, but I think it's just at the moment it's such a wonderful example.
Course.
You see this now with all the policies that Donald Trump is enacting. Like, for example, the executive order he signed a couple of days ago to ban men in women's sport. According to recent polls, 79% of Americans agree. And the left disagrees. So the left is holding the 20% position, and Donald Trump is representing the 79% position. So I'm asking you, who is on the fringe here and who is actually smack in the center of public opinion? And this is what we see, I believe, also in Europe increasingly, that people take a second look at those right-wing parties, and the right-wing parties take another look at the people, and they say, wait a moment, actually your positions, they're not radical. They're just common sense, normal positions.
Yes, I think you laid it out quite well there. And I think more people are aware now that their positions are not weird or radical or even a minority. I think this makes people more willing to stand out. And I think we saw this breaking, for example, in the Netherlands at the last election in November of 2023, when people were open about voting for Geert Wilders for the first time. And beforehand, if you were a part of this party, you could literally not get a job sometimes.
Yeah.
I think it's a hopeful situation. Do you think that this also helps now in the negotiations? Of course, the FBO and OFP, they are now negotiating. From what I understand of the situation, they're discussing mostly now who gets which ministries and stuff. But I see that there's hope that the topics at hand, that they are going to form a coalition. What do you think about the situation?
Well, I think they will form a coalition because due to the significant losses the Conservatives had to endure as a consequence of the last election, their war chest is empty. They have no money. So new elections or snap elections they could not burden that financially. They would not survive it financially. So they are more or less bound into that coalition government. And as you correctly pointed out, the FPÖ, they're going all in, right? They are not, and this is what they're communicating very clearly. They say they want actual change. Their argument, they went into this election by saying that the way we did things up until now is no longer working. We need to do things differently. And from what we have heard and see now, this is exactly how they are leading these negotiations. Again, it's not yet concluded. Who knows what might still happen? So we might talk again in a week, and everything has been everything broke down. But at the moment, it seems that they're driving as hard a bargain as they can. I'm sure they will compromise on some areas.
Of course.
But for example, migration was a huge promise, and they want to keep that promise. And again, this goes back to the American phenomenon. We are experiencing a time where politicians are, which didn't happen for a long time, are expected again to keep the promises they made during election campaign. And that's a good thing. Right? People have gone so numb, right? So disillusioned. They said, politicians, they promise everything, but they never keep it. But now, based on what we've seen in the United States, a growing number of people says, wait a moment, if the guy across the Atlantic can actually deliver on his promises, why can't you guys? And this is what the FPÖ also knows. They know they have to deliver. Like if they want to make this a success, if they want to make sure that they don't end up like the Conservatives and lose 11 percentage points at the next election, they have to deliver, right? People must say after 2-3 years of this government, they must say, you know what? They went in with their promises and they kept 60% of their promises. So they have no choice.
Do you think that there's also a realistic possibility that they will not, I guess, finalize the government? Let's say theoretical that this coalition cannot form. Of course, they already tried ÖFP to form a government without FPÖ, so that there are no options left then, right? What I think they also don't have another choice, literally, because all the other options already tried.
And that's true. And you would also play a risky game with public patience. The economic situation, like in Germany and Austria, is not very good at the moment. So people want to function in government, and they want to function in government yesterday, if at all possible. So if you now say we break off these conversations, these negotiations, and start the same kind of negotiations that just broke down a couple of weeks ago, people will say that's ridiculous. And so and then you probably will have snap elections. And I would argue then the FPÖ is probably not going to have 29%. They're probably going to have 35%.
It's in this sense, it's exciting times. I want to look a little bit with you about some issues where you think that this government will make changes. Like, I guess let's start with the most obvious one, migration. What do you expect of this, I guess, potential new government? What will they change on the migration, you think?
Well, that's the big question, right? I think one of the things they definitely try to do, again, very similar to what's happening in Germany, is to reduce dependency of whether it's recent migrants, asylum seekers, those who are under temporary protection, that their access to the welfare state is going to be limited, that their access to the healthcare system is limited. The idea basically being that if you want to get something out of the social system, you need to be someone who actually paid into it. I think that family reunification will be curtailed. So there are, I think, many steps that they can do. The issue is, and this is going to be the interesting part, that of course there are many legal constructs, both on the national and European level, that do make an entirely independent migration policy very difficult. However, like we saw in the United States, at least the things, some of them, not all of them, because, for example, the European Convention of Human Rights is part of the Austrian Constitution. So there you would need a constitutional amendment. But other agreements, you can modify or you can leave them. So this is going to be very interesting, as is the idea of deporting people who have committed crimes. So can you then find ways, and there already was an Austrian delegation in Afghanistan, right, to negotiate in what ways Afghanistan would take back migrants from Austria. And then you have, of course, these entire debates about, who is an asylum seeker, who is a refugee in what category, who deserves temporary protection, do they have the right to family unification or not? So there are many, small cogs and switches on which they can work. I mean, what is unfortunately not going to happen, and this will be the first potential disappointment for the people, is the problem areas. For example, schools in Vienna where 90% of the pupils speak Arabic and not German. That's not going to change from one day to the next, unfortunately. Even I know the party wants to change that, but there is not much that they can do. So there is already a little bit, I would argue, or significantly actually, the risk of a major disappointment among the population.
That's a fair point. Don't you think also? I think one of the things that Donald Trump is kind of showing is that sometimes you just need to also really make big statements, really go all in. You see that with what he's doing with the tariffs, for example, with Mexico and with Canada. He doesn't actually want the tariffs. He's just using it to get what he wants. And there's a lot of the more, let's say, wealthy countries in Europe, they have a lot of power in the European Union, like Austria, like the Netherlands, like Germany, to also say, okay, either we get an exception or we just stop paying for now at the European level. Because if you're actually paying more than you're gaining from literally from the budgeting, I don't see a lot of parties that are daring to do this in none of these countries. So I'm kind of shocked. Maybe you can tell me what your thoughts are on why this is not happening in, let's say, our part of Europe.
Well, I think there are three things we have to distinguish. One is, what are you allowed to do?
Yes.
What can you do?
Yes.
And what is appropriate to do? And what I mean by this is, for example, just as Donald Trump has shown, and as you just mentioned, is you can be part of an international agreement and you can leave it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can have a conversation on whether that's appropriate or not, but you can do it. You don't have to be part of the Paris Climate Accords. You don't have to be part of the World Health Organization. You don't have to be part of the UN Council of Human Rights. Right? You can leave them.
Mm-hmm.
You can, as a country, protect your borders, right? Up to the point where, again, it's not something I hope to see. It's not something that I would encourage, but hypothetically, at least, that can also include violence, meaning that nobody has the right to come into your country. Mm-hmm. And if they try to do it violently or illegally, you have a right to as it's nowadays called, to do pushbacks. So say, no, you cannot come in. Now, we can then say, some people would argue, well, that's not appropriate. But the question is, maybe, but can you do it? The answer is yes. And then there is the allowed part, and that's trickier for Europeans than it is for the Americans, because in Europe, we have, with the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights and all those institutions, we have created, I would call it, legal handcuffs that make it very tricky for European governments to do something without being in violation of certain laws. Now, this brings, however, back to the other point I said, you might not be allowed to do something, but of course you still can do it. So, and this is going to be the interesting question, especially with migration. Will we reach a point where governments will say, whether it's just the FPÖ in Austria as well, will say, we know that there is a legal ruling that would prevent us from doing A, B, and C, but we don't care. We do it anyways because we see it as crucial for the national interests of our country. And let me give you a very quick example. I'm sure that you know this, but your viewers probably do not, and they can look it up. The ruling is open access, so everybody can find it on the official page of the European Court of Justice. Right? I mean, the European Court of Justice gave a blanket right to women of Afghanistan to be granted refugee status. I mean, basically they said that 90 because I couldn't believe it, so I looked up the original ruling. It explicitly says, right, that this is a blanket ruling and it's not necessary to do this on a case-by-case basis. So basically, if you are a woman with an Afghan passport or that can somehow credibly claim that she's from Afghanistan, you have a right to asylum. You have to be recognized as a refugee. So based on the European Court of Justice rulings, Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands would have no legal way. I mean, it's a logistical problem, right? All these women have no logistical ways to come to Europe. But let's assume that they could come to Europe. These European sovereign nations would have no way to reject them, even if this would, if 9 million Austrians and you bring in 19 million Afghan women, this country is no longer recognizably Austrian.
No.
But based on the European Court of Justice's rulings, we would have to endure that. So, and this is the question that we also have to ask, and that I believe many European politicians are still shying away from, which is, are the rulings of these European institutions really in the interest of the people, or are we back to what we talked about at the beginning of today's episode, which is that there's an ideological component to it, and there is an ideological component to it, because if you're a judge I think that the European Court of Justice is in Luxembourg, if I'm not mistaken. Whoever wrote that ruling, I mean, must know this is basically, again, it's a logistical problem because these 19 million people cannot come easily to Europe. But if they would somehow overcome that logistical barrier, this is a forced suicide note to small European nations. You tell an 8 million nation in the heart of Europe, if 19 million Afghans knock on your door, you have to open your door. That's insanity. And the counter argument that many of my critics make say, well, but Ralph, you know that 90 million Afghan women are not going to come to Austria. The point is that they have the right to.
Yeah.
You have a situation where in a very far away country with which neither the Netherlands nor Austria nor other European countries have any historical connection. We were never a colonial power there. There was never part of the Austro-Hungarian or Dutch Empire. Right? They got a blanket allowance to come to Europe, to come to whichever you like. Even if you say it's then distributed all over Europe, 90 million people. And the next point, of course, is you would have then to ask the question, well, what about women and people in other areas of the world that live in similar conditions? Do they also have the same blanket universal rights to come to Europe? And if the European Court of Justice thinks it has the authority to more or less tell the historically grown nations of Europe that they no longer have a say in who is living in their country, I'm sorry. This is a ruling I would reject. This is a court I would reject.
Definitely. And it's even worse because if you cannot even define what the woman is, then who says that that you can also have all the other men of Afghanistan come? Like, let's be honest, if you were a man living under Afghan Taliban rule, and you could just say, I'm a woman, and then you're allowed into Europe, of course you would say that. Everybody would. I would as well.
That's an excellent point. I've never thought about it, but you're actually absolutely right. You only have to self-identify as an Afghan woman. And so we're not talking about 19 million. We're probably going to talk about 25 million. So this... And there are other things, for example, which was this was a German case, where you cannot prevent refugees from going to their home countries for vacation.
Yes.
I'm sorry, you're not a refugee if you go to the country in which you're supposedly persecuted to visit family or go to a wedding. And this is, as I said, if rulings are so blatantly absurd, I do not think that you have to follow them, that you have to respect them.
I think we agree on this. I'm also curious, of course, what you think about, let's say that we now have a different government in Austria. Do you think their stance on geopolitics, for example, with Ukraine, Russia, but also maybe with the United States, do you think this will actually change if you have this new government?
A little bit, although the Austria is a small country, so our stance, our position on the Russia-Ukraine war was never going to have any significant impact. But of course, what is true is that there will be growing momentum, particularly from Central European countries, to push towards a rather quick conclusion of hostilities, a ceasefire, and a resolution of the war. But I believe that the German elections and, of course, the elections that took place in the United States will have a bigger impact on that. So this is because this is an argument that is also made here that the FPÖ's supposed friendliness towards Russia is a big issue, but I really don't think it is, because we are not a geopolitical player. So for the average Austrian, the position on the war in Ukraine is only insofar relevant as what it means, for example, for energy prices, what it means for economic relations with Russia. But I've made this argument in public and also make it here, that given the conditions Europe finds itself in, even those who currently claim that there will never, ever again be economic and political relations with Russia, as soon as the ceasefire is in place, I promise you, from European companies to European politicians, everybody will stand ready to reopen up both the flow of energy, but also the flow of goods and services between Russia and Europe. So this, politicians say lots of things if they believe that it suits the moment, but reality has a way of reasserting itself.
That's fair, but do you actually think that FPÖ is, because you already said it a little bit, that they are actually pro-Russian or whatever that might mean? Or
well, I think pro-Russian is an exaggeration. It's so nobody in the FPÖ wishes, for example, for the annexation or destruction of Ukraine. But are they? Let's put it this way: are they eager to reestablish a normalization with Russia, even at the expense of Ukraine? I think the answer is yes. I think one has to be that we owe our honesty and the honesty to our viewers and listeners to say, yeah, that is a somewhat, I would argue, problem, or it can be a problematic position. I think that would be a fair assessment.
That's a fair point. Do you think this new government will have on any other issue? Do you think they will have dramatically different policy than what the current government
I
used to have?
I think one large area is going to be the Green Deal.
Oh, yes.
I think that the kind of von der Leyen's pet project of the Green Deal is coming under increased pressure from these new right-leaning governments, or these potential future right-leaning governments. I think there will be more and more pressure on the EU to change. They do not, and they made this very explicit, they do not favor Austria leaving the EU, but they want the EU to be more respectful, let's put it this way, towards the sovereignty of the member states. So that's, I think, going to be a big issue, because in the past, both the Greens and the Conservatives were more or less fully on board with the way in which the EU was run. I think that's going to come to an end fairly quickly, at least from the Austrian perspective. If it's going to have any impact in Brussels, that remains to be seen. I think there will be a change in the realm of economics, meaning that also on the national level, the net zero obsession will come to a very quick end. Of course, there's a lot of hope for abandoning massive regulation and also for vetoing where possible, or trying to alter things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism or CO2 taxations, and all these ideas that ultimately are just a huge burden for the economy without any measurable effect either on the climate, or apart from a negative one, or on the European economy.
Yes, I think if you look at Germany, then you know how to destroy an economy if you want to continue the Green Deal. I think it's no different in the Netherlands, and probably also not in Austria. I think the Green Deal is coming to an end anyway. I don't know if you followed the scandal with Frans Timmermans and with the Green Deal, that actually they used funding of the European Union to fund NGOs to promote the Green Deal. And that's coming out now. I think that the European Union, or European Commission to be specific, has they have no moral way to stay with this policy.
No, I think you're right, and this is so fascinating, because this is now coming out all over the world. Precisely what you described, that so many of these grassroots movements, between quotation marks, of these, civil society movements, were in fact directly or indirectly funded by government or international institutions that were pursuing their own agenda. I mean, this is, again, whatever one thinks about Trump, the fact that this is finally coming out alone was worth him getting elected, because this is, I think, quite shocking. I mean, as you correctly described this, right? I mean, we were told that independent NGOs, independent think tanks have been supportive of the Green Deal and the green transition, and it turns out no. Like these were political parties that were funneling money to people who then supported their positions under the veneer of independency. So these are, to be quite frank here, these are massive scandals, because they belie the claim that the left is representing neutral positions. They have just financed everyone who claimed to be neutral, and then they put on the mantle of neutrality, when in fact they were infiltrating, mostly financially, right, from academia to culture to the university scene to the think tanks, pretty much every institution there was. And I'm glad that this is coming out into the open.
Yes, and I think the last one that people are still kind of afraid to talk about, and we already talked a little bit about it, is like the lawfare, the judges, the legal courts. I think this is you can see it also, let's say, in Italy, when you have the Albania deal, and Meloni's trying to push like immigrants to Albania, and they're taken back every time by the Italian courts and the European courts. And it's happening, of course, in many countries, many examples. I think the irony for the left and for everyone is that you want to get to a situation where we can build up again high trust societies, where we trust our institutions because they're worth trusting. And of course, you should not blindly trust them, but at least trust them to a decent more amount, like we used to, I guess. And they're just destroying it, which in the end will eat up themselves. This is
the assumption. No, you're right. But when you look at the courts, like the example you made with Italy, I mean, the idea is kind of, in whose name are these courts speaking?
Yes.
Are they speaking on behalf of, let's say, Italian law, the Italian people, or are they speaking on behalf of some idea of, a universalist approach to the human species? And I just don't think that's, also from their perspective, I don't think that's appropriate.
Yes.
mass migration in Europe is a serious problem. And if there is a sense, sometimes justified, sometimes unjustified, that apparently courts take the side of migrants more often than they take the side of their own people, honestly, I would be suspicious too.
Yes.
This is that the first responsibility of a government is towards its own people. Again, that doesn't mean that, as you said, that the people should blindly trust them. That doesn't mean that the government should simply do everything that people want. But they should act in their main interest. They should be guardians of the people's interest, and they should have the well-being and the current, past, and future prosperity of their people at heart. And I'm just, when it comes especially to the Brussels-based institutions, I'm not sure if this is the way they think about any of this. I don't think that the Greens in Germany or the Greens in the Netherlands think like this. I don't think that they care about Germany. I don't think that they care about the Netherlands. And the same in Austria. It's unfortunately or fortunately, whatever term you want to use, the only parties that openly promote putting the interest of their country first, America first, Austria first, the Netherlands first, Germany first, or everything for Germany, as Ms. Weidel would say, are the right-wing parties. And from a pure emotional perspective, I mean, why would I vote for a party in a national election that openly says that they don't care about the nation in which this election is actually taking place?
That's a very fair point, and I think it's surprising even that they were able to stay in power this long.
Oh yes,
it's an accomplishment in itself, right? You can at least say that there is some intelligence in there. Sadly, it's used for the wrong ideas and the wrong actual movement. But we can respect, at least I respect a lot, the organizational skills and the skills to actually push through their agenda. This has been masterful, I think.
Oh yeah, 100% on 100%. I could not agree more.
I really want to thank you. I think people have now a bigger perspective now also on Austria. I think we'll follow it. If there are more updates in Austria, then we have maybe another conversation. I really want to thank you for talking to me today. If people want to follow you, where can they do that?
The easiest way to do it is to just Google my name. You cannot miss it.
All right. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you.
And also thank you for our NieuwRechts lezers, readers, and also listeners. If you want to support these kind of conversations, please consider subscribing at NieuwRechts.nl or one of our social media networks. Thank you, and see you in the next one.
Thank you.